To progress is to suffer less. In other words, the less you suffer, the less suffering you cause, and the less suffering society inflicts is the most objective metric of progress. By objective, I don't mean perfectly measurable. I mean the closest thing we have to a common denominator. Every system and ideology eventually has to answer to the impact of its beliefs and actions on the suffering it creates or mitigates. Because suffering is a one metric every ideology eventually cashes out into, whether it admits it or not. I'm Zach Charles, the author of Sufferless, a science and philosophy of reducing suffering. Overview. The book asks, what if the purpose of life isn't to seek happiness, but to suffer less? We measure progress all the time, GDP, growth, output, but those numbers can climb while suffering simply is hidden, exported, or postponed. Most metrics are just proxies. When you interrogate their value, you find that suffering is often the thing they're trying to buy down. Every proxy eventually has to answer one question. Did it reduce suffering or just move it elsewhere? Money can buy food and shelter, but the same chase can make you sedentary, anxious, and spiritually empty. That is the danger of proxies. The number can rise while suffering changes form. The litmus test is what I call the sufferless filter. Does this reduce net suffering or just hide it, outsource it, or postpone it? This isn't a doctrine. It's a compass. And compasses get recalibrated when they're wrong. And net suffering isn't a slogan. It means total suffering across physical, psychological, intellectual, and spiritual domains, weighted by how intense it is and how long it lasts. It's not a single number. It's an audit lens, a way to force hidden costs into the conversation. If you zoom out, most of modern life is an argument about metrics. We measure what's easy to count, and then we start calling it progress. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it works so well, it becomes dangerous because the numbers can climb while the human reality underneath gets worse. To be clear, not all suffering is profound. Some of it is just stupid. Autoplay music websites, insurance claim forms that seem to have been designed by Kafka, the modern airline boarding process, which somehow still ends in a stampede. These examples may be trivial, but they're perfect microcosms. Friction's born of poor design and inertia, the same forces that scale up into societal suffering. So the sufferless philosophy is a compass. It's a way of asking, if we're serious about progress, what's the most objective thing progress should reduce? And that claim is simple. Progress should reduce suffering without hiding it, exporting it, or postponing it. The modern problem is that our tools advance faster than our wisdom. So progress can look like progress while suffering quietly scales. Now we have to define what exactly suffering is. Part 1. Philosophy of suffering. Let's start with a bold claim first, because it's the one thing that reorients everything. Life exists because of suffering, meaning once an organism can feel aversion, that signal is what makes survival possible in real time. Because without aversion, without stress that a sentient organism must respond to, there's no pressure to adapt. Now, that can sound dramatic until you name what suffering means in this framework. Suffering is what happens when stress exceeds capacity in a nervous system that can register aversion and creates a state that system wishes not to be in. When you define it that way, the claim becomes less poetic and more biological. Without that signal, there's no reason to adapt, no reason to learn, no reason to change. The discomfort of hunger drives movement. The sting of pain drives withdrawal. Remove the signal, and you remove the mechanism that keeps the organism in the game. So suffering isn't just a burden to endure. It's also information. It's like an internal alarm system that says conditions are wrong, do something. And because it's information, the point is not to hate it. The point is to interpret it correctly. Suffering causes suffering. When stress exceeds capacity, the system compensates, and those compensations often become new stressors. That is how pain spreads, inside a person, between people, and through institutions. This isn't the only lens. It's the one I found most clarifying when progress gets confusing. It's also where Sufferless has a different emphasis than Buddhist framing. Buddhism begins with a rigorous diagnosis of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, and a path to reduce it. This isn't a rebuttal. It's a different entry point. Sufferless is emphasizing something adjacent, the evolutionary function of aversion as an adaptation signal. Life exists because of suffering, not as punishment, not as a cosmic flaw, as the engine of adaptation. And the shift matters because it changes the goal. The goal stops being escape suffering at all costs and becomes reduce unnecessary suffering while preserving the signal that keeps you aligned with reality. Which brings us to meaning. We root meaning in all kinds of constructs: GDP charts, status ledgers, tribal narratives, inherited moral scoreboards. The problem isn't that those things are useless. The problem is that they become disconnected from consequences. They can drift into abstraction while real suffering gets displaced off screen. Rooting meaning in suffering, reduction, is different because it's harder to fake. It forces a question back into lived reality. Who suffers, how much, and for how long? Now, we need a map because suffering doesn't show up in one uniform shape. It shows up across domains: physical, psychological, intellectual, spiritual, and it moves across tiers: the self, relationships, society, and the natural world. This is why we need a hierarchy of suffering. Most people know Maslow's hierarchy, a static ladder of needs. This is different. The hierarchy of suffering is dynamic. It's a scalable map of how suffering moves, compounds, and changes form across the self, relationships, society, and the natural world. Because not all pain weighs equally, and not all loops require equal urgency. And here's the final bridge out of part one. Before we can reduce suffering in the self, relationships, and society at large, we need a solid foundation of understanding knowledge. Because without the ability to discern, update, and apply knowledge, attempting to reduce suffering is futile. So we need truth before we can do good, meaning better calibration between our beliefs and reality. Part 2, knowledge, perception, and truth. We don't passively take in reality. We often simulate it and patch in data as needed. Even the parts we think we see is astonishingly incomplete. Human vision is limited to the visual spectrum. Bees can perceive ultraviolet patterns on flowers that are invisible to us. Mantis shrimp sample visual information with the richness that makes our palette look incomplete. The fact that these realities exist all around us is a reminder that much is unseen. We don't see things as they actually are in full, only as our biology allows. That doesn't mean reality is subjective. It means our access to it is. Human vision has a limited temporal resolution, which is why very fast events blur together and why the brain often fills in the gaps. Most of what you think you see is often inference, not direct observation. The periaqueductal gray in the midbrain can modulate sensory experiences depending on context. In extreme situations, pain can be temporarily muted long enough to act. In a quiet hospital bed, that same injury could feel excruciating. That doesn't make pain imaginary. It means pain is real and context sensitive. Pain and pleasure aren't fixed. They're often negotiated between body and brain based on predicted priorities. Evolution often favored perception tuned for survival, the useful hallucination over the exact truth. If our sensory hardware is a bottleneck, our cognitive software has its own quirks. Chief among them is confirmation bias. Neuroscience even hints at a signature here. Belief-confirming information can engage the brain's reward circuitry. It can literally feel good to be right, even if the thing we're right about is completely wrong. The point isn't that reward explains everything. It's that reinforcement makes beliefs sticky. The result is a perceptual self-enforcement loop. Anchoring bias keeps us chained to the first number or idea we encounter. Availability bias makes rare events seem common if they're vivid enough in memory. Status quo bias persuades us that the current state of affairs must be the correct one simply because it exists. None of these are malicious. They're just side effects of a brain tuned for speed and certainty rather than objectivity. Confirmation bias is just the start. Our minds come with dozens of shortcuts that trade accuracy for speed. So, if perception is inference and inference is biased, the question becomes, how should the mind relate to truth? One useful frame is Bayesian epistemology. It treats beliefs as probabilities, not identities. You don't have beliefs, you hold confidence levels. And learning becomes a disciplined process of updating those confidence levels when new evidence arrives. Bayesian thinking is basically start with the prior, encounter evidence, update. It's not about being right, it's about being updatable. And this matters because confirmation bias does the opposite. It turns a provisional model into a defended worldview. Bayesian thinking keeps the model provisional and makes the revision a feature, not a threat. So if your perception is incomplete and your cognition is biased, the obvious risk is that you'll reduce suffering in a way that just relocates it. You'll treat symptoms, you'll defend stories, you'll optimize metrics that feel moral but aren't real. And that's why the Sufferless philosophy puts epistemology before self-actualization. Once you can discern, update, and apply knowledge more honestly, the next question is, where do you have the most agency to do something about it? The answer is the self. Part 3, the self. If the self is the governing body of one individual, then the first responsibility is internal governance. By governing body, I mean the layer where responsibility and agency actually live. The self governs through attention, choice, and behavior. And in this philosophy, governance isn't abstract authority. It's practical responsibility. Interpret signals as stress, allocate capacity, act so suffering decreases over time. So the question becomes, where is suffering inside you trying to direct you? Parts 3 through 5 follow a simple pattern. Misalignment creates suffering, and alignment is how it resolves. This section of suffering philosophy treats the self like a system. Picture the self as a four-legged table. Physical, psychological, intellectual, spiritual. All supports share the same load. Stress rarely attacks all at once. One leg weakens, shifts the wobble, then strains another. Collapse is never about one leg. It's about the system's inability to rebalance under uneven stress. And the key dynamic is simple. Misalignment doesn't stay contained. It radiates. Physical suffering appears first, then psychological burdens follow, and finally, meaning collapses. If part 3 is about the suffering self, physical suffering is the most visible entry point where stress exceeds capacity. It's the doorway through which misalignment becomes undeniable. Physical suffering is the body's blunt announcement that stress has exceeded capacity. It anchors us in the reality that biology has boundaries. Pain is not suffering. Pain is a message. Suffering is what happens when stress exceeds capacity and traps us in a state the body wishes not to be in. Touching a hot pan delivers pain. Living with arthritis delivers suffering. And in practice, physical suffering shows up through 3 channels: abrupt structural failure, slow systemic drift, and lifestyle mismatches that trains the body away from its design. Sometimes capacity fails suddenly. Bone fractures, tendons snap. Other times it fails quietly. Systems drifting for years before you feel the cost. In all of these, the math doesn't change. Capacity has been exceeded, and you're now in a condition you wish not to be in. That includes pain, inflammation, fatigue, and maladaptive pain loops that persist beyond utility. To reduce suffering in the self, we use the mechanisms of knowledge of both general physiology as well as knowledge of unique traits. Genetic traits that change what stress your body can handle. For example, skin pigmentation, changing vulnerability to UV exposure. The point isn't optimization. It's coherence. And the moment you start building coherence in the self, something else becomes obvious. Misalignment doesn't stay contained. It radiates. And unresolved suffering of the self transmits into relationships. Here's a recursion, as Richard Rohr puts it. Pain that is not transformed is transmitted. If the self is a governing body of one nervous system, then a relationship is the governing body of the people bound within it. And if governance fails in the self, it becomes a problem the relationship has to govern next. Part 4, relationships. If a relationship is the governing body of the people bound within it, then relationships are not just emotional experiences. They are systems of governance. A relationship governs through shared norms, boundaries, and repair. And the reason that matters is simple. Unresolved suffering doesn't stay contained. It transfers. Relationships are the transmission lines through which suffering becomes systemic. Here's the understated version of transference. Someone is stressed and sleep deprived. Their patience thins, they become more reactive. The other person starts bracing. Trust drops a few degrees. Small misreads start compounding. And suddenly both people are suffering over something that began as biology. That's why the philosophy treats relationships as systems, not just emotions. Misalignment shows up as repeated conflicts that never reach resolution. Alignment, in contrast, doesn't mean no stress. It means a relationship has tools and mutual resilience that prevent stress from calcifying into suffering. This is where co-regulation matters. The nervous system doesn't exist in isolation. When one person is dysregulated, the other registers it. Alignment means noticing that contagion and working with it rather than against it. And because rupture is inevitable, longevity depends less on the absence of conflict and more on the speed and quality of repair. So the practical point isn't avoid rupture. It's build a repair culture. Regulate, acknowledge, validate, adjust. Not as a script you recite, but as a muscle you strengthen. If suffering can transfer from one person to another, it can just as easily transfer from households into institutions, from workplaces into economies, and congregations into cultures. At scale, the same dynamic becomes structural. Part 5, society. Society is the largest governing body. Society is a governing body responsible for reducing preventable non-consensual suffering across its members at every scale: community, regional, national, global. And that ledger includes not just humans, but the natural world we offload suffering onto. Not by limiting struggle, but by limiting how much suffering institutions can impose without consent, visibility, and recourse. Suffering is rarely annihilated. It's usually displaced, hidden, outsourced, or postponed until someone else pays. At scale, suffering becomes easier to hide. Not because people are evil, but because large systems are built out of abstraction. Bureaucracy, metrics, distance, anonymity, these can dissolve the empathy loop. And the bigger the scale, the easier it is for suffering to be transferred, offloaded to someone else, or postponed into the future. You can buy a $5 t-shirt and it feels like a bargain. But it can be a passport of suffering somewhere in the chain. Cotton picked under pesticide clouds, hands in factories paid pennies, rivers dyed with chemicals, landfills your grandchildren inherit. A shirt is cheap because suffering has been outsourced. That is the pattern at scale. Suffering isn't gone, it's just somewhere else. History is full of the same pattern. Industrial wealth wasn't conjured out of brilliance alone. It was collateralized by human bodies. Even after abolition, suffering didn't disappear. In many places, it mutated into new coercive systems and new ledgers. Or consider synthetic ammonia. It's one of the invisible pillars of modern civilization. It made large-scale agriculture possible, and it fed billions. It solved one kind of suffering while creating new forms downstream. But it also locked us into a fragile system. Runoff, dead zones, dependency, and ecological debt. The benefit was immediate. The costs delayed. And the people paying it didn't consent. And this is the point. At scale, systems can look like progress while quietly writing suffering into the future. So, part 6 asks, what do we build so harm can't hide? And the default outcome is less suffering. Part 6, Sufferless applied. Part 6 is the toolkit. Education, so we can think clearly. A shared language of suffering, so we can talk clearly. Design principles, so compassion becomes structural. Institutions, so accountability survives scale. And AI, because the most powerful tool ever built must be governed by the same ethic. It starts with education. Education should not be workforce training. It should be suffering reduction training, meaning suffering literacy, how to perceive harm, think clearly, regulate the self, and build repairable systems. In practice, that looks like teaching the fundamentals most people never formally learned. How sleep debt changes mood and impulse control, how nutrition and movement can affect stress tolerance, how to regulate the autonomic nervous system with breathing, basic first aid and emergency medicine, and enough psychology to repair relationships instead of repeating the same fights for 20 years. Sufferless is the framework I'm proposing education be built around. Understanding the philosophy of suffering and epistemology to effectively reduce suffering in the self, relationships, and society. And the structure is simple. Teach the arc in order. The philosophy of suffering, how to learn, biology, relationships, society, and applied design. If you design education around standardized tests, you get test takers. If you design it around workforce pipelines, you get workers. If you design it around suffering literacy, you get humans who can learn, adapt, and live with compassion. It doesn't hand students a worldview. It gives them tools to test worldviews against consequences. Now, once you can map suffering, you need a shared language for it. A suffering audit asks 5 questions. What's the visibility, magnitude, duration, distribution, and reversibility? This is not a moral verdict. It's a way to keep the argument tethered to consequences. And this is where you can stress test it on the most divisive issues we have: vaccines, abortion, prisons, climate. Not to force agreement, but to force a shared grammar of harm. For climate, that means asking what harm is visible now, what's delayed, and what is irreversible. More extreme weather patterns, crop failure, displacement, conflict, suffering with long duration and low reversibility. So the honest question becomes, which pathway minimizes irreversible suffering over time? This isn't a verdict. It's a translation tool, regardless of your politics. It doesn't tell you what to value. It helps you to see what your values do. Now, language gives us a shared map of harm, but a map alone can't tell us how to walk. So we need principles, rules of the road that translate recognition into action. First principle, reduce net suffering without hiding it, outsourcing it, or postponing it. So here are the design heuristics, the guardrails that keep good intentions from becoming new harm. Reversibility, visibility of harm, repairability, incentive alignment, equity. And humans don't just need survival. They need orientation. Purpose, ikigai, as it's known in Japan, is where suffering becomes metabolized into meaning. But principles don't enforce themselves. At scale, the problem isn't just bad intent. It's weak feedback loops. When harm is distant, delayed, or abstract, systems can look like progress while quietly multiplying suffering. So the question becomes institutional. What do we build so consequences can't hide? This is where guardrails stop becoming moral decoration and become circuit breakers. Transparency, audit trails, feedback loops, harm ledgers. The point is simple. Force reality back into the system. And this is where the Sufferless Foundation comes in. Not as a replacement for government, companies, schools, or healthcare, but as a nervous system layered across what already exists. Sensing, certifying, guiding, protecting. Not as a government, not as a moral court, as an opt-in standard competing in the open. And any audit can be challenged. Any standard can be revised. Disagreement is part of the system. And the ledger stays public, so power can't hide behind the label. It translates this philosophy into standards, audits, and incentives, so harm can stay visible and accountability survives scale. And it can't be exempt from its own test. Does it reduce suffering or merely move it somewhere else? Because any metric can be gamed. Any label can be weaponized. So the design rule is simple. If it fails, let it fail where suffering becomes visible. Now AI. Artificial intelligence sits at the same threshold as past miracles. Technologies that reduced immense suffering and smuggled in invisible debts. But AI is different. AI is not merely a tool, it's an amplifier. And in many real-world deployments, it can function like an agent, making choices, shaping environments, and moving information at scale. Tools extend human capacity, but they don't decide how they're used. AI increasingly does. That's why AI can't be governed only at the level of human use. The same compass has to be embedded into the decisions these systems make. AI should never be the moral authority. It should be the instrument panel. Imagine a sufferless AI. Not a corporate chatbot optimized for attention, but a system guided by one mandate. Reduce unnecessary suffering without transferring it elsewhere. For individuals, it can map stress and capacity and suggest interventions that reduce suffering directly, and not just shift it into another domain. For societies, it can run policies through the same audit, modeling hidden suffering costs, testing whether a law reduces suffering or exports it. Just as societies require governance guardrails, AI requires philosophical guardrails. Autonomy and consent preserved, dignity and meaning protected, distributional impacts audited. Reversibility preferred, no deception or censorship as cure, epistemic humility built in. Not as vibes, through standards, audits, and external oversight that can be challenged and revised. And when uncertainty looms, the ethic is simple. Fail safe. Prefer the path that minimizes irreversible harm over speed, efficiency, or profit. Design is where compassion becomes real. I am not outside the problem. I'm trying to build a way through it. So the full arc is suffering as signal, knowledge as foundation, the self as a first laboratory, relationships as a transmission layer, society as scaled consequence, and design as the responsibility. To progress is to suffer less.